Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Superb. Great. Well, we're a minute past the half hour, but this should hopefully be an exciting conversation around the role of geopolitics in data. So we'll give it maybe another minute or two, and then we'll just jump in and start the conversation. I won't be super fussy. We're sort of playing by the seat of our pants here, as the expression goes. So we'll keep it very casual, pretty dynamic, and just have everybody introduce themselves. Pari, would you like to start?
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk. And I'm president of Global Technopolitics Forum. It's a think tank in California, working at the intersection of technology and geopolitics. I'm a social entrepreneur, internet pioneer, and technology expert and sustainability executive. And so I think that's all I can say about myself. I've written recently a major work on data governance and geopolitics, and I think that would be part of my discussion today.
Awesome. Thanks, Pari. That was fabulous. Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Beverly. Hi, everybody. My name is Steve McFeely. I'm the Director of Data and Analytics at the World Health Organization, and I'm also co-chair of the Chief Statisticians Group of the UN system. So interested in data, statistics, and obviously all of the issues around the fragmenting data universe and the geopolitics that goes with it.
Excellent. And last but not least, I think our moderator may join, but I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Beverly Hatcher-Mbu. I'm a manager of the operations team at Development Gateway. We're an international nonprofit organization focused at the intersection of technology and development. So we do a lot around open data, service delivery. We have an in-house team of both software developers and project managers. So you'll hear a little bit more about our experiences. We work all around the world, but we've got a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's the position from which I come from. I'm a lawyer by training. I'm British-born Nigerian, and those influence sort of my viewpoint around the geopolitics of data. So we'll get into that in a moment. Not sure if we want to jump in. I think we can start. We can just talk about the session. Oh, Stuart, like magic. Hi. I conjured him and he's here. Welcome, Stuart.
Sorry, I was emceeing one session. I had to jump straight on here because we've had someone taken off ill. So I'm literally just switched straight over. I have to juggle all my audio settings. It's great to be with you all. Thank you for waiting for me. So
we just did a round of brief introductions, and then we were just about to start talking about the background to the session. So if you want to jump in from there.
Thank you. So yeah, I mean, I'm just going to make a quick intro, and really it's for me to kind of steer this and for you guys to contribute. Well, thank you to everyone for joining this live session. We're here to discuss what geopolitics means for data sharing specifically. There's been a lot about data sharing during today's summit. What happens when it potentially can lead to things like human rights abuses, climate crises, and acts of terrorism, and how do we, but those are negative things. There's obviously a huge amount of benefits and opportunities about sharing data. So how do we weigh these things up? This panel will run for 30 minutes, and we very much welcome your participation. So audience members, please do get stuck in. So I think my panelists have introduced themselves. Are the panelists happy that they don't need further introductions?
Yeah.
You're fine.
Good. Okay.
No ceremony here.
Okay, good. Let's get straight to it. How does geopolitics impact data in terms of approaches, policies, and attitudes? Pari, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I think the relationship is interactive. Data by nature as a byproduct of internet digital age, it transcends national boundaries. And as such, it is reconfiguring the geopolitical landscape and creating a tension. That geopolitical landscape not only is divided by national boundaries and borders, but it's also divided by ideological and cultural differences, giving rise to different visions of internet and data flow, and therefore policies that relates to the area. In the process, the ways data collected, stored, protected, accessed, used, transferred, all that have become geopolitical issues. The problem is the complexity and speed of these changes goes beyond the capability of existing rule-based global architecture and its institution. We are addressing 21st century issues and problems with 20th century tools and mindset.
Thanks, Parry. And I mean, you've highlighted some of the massive challenges we're facing there. I mean, Beverly, you've got a lot of experience working in kind of different environments across the world. How does some of what Parry said kind of, how do you respond to that?
I think Parry is the perfect opener, because really what the conversation that we're having around geopolitics is that there are so many conversations on both a global but also a local level. So the 21st century conversation I think Parry is alluding to is really about how we're looking at in a human rights framework in a new generation, digital rights in a new generation, where a lot of the decision making is happening, or the conversation is starting in Europe with the GDPR, in the US, in China, but there's so many more voices. Everybody has a smartphone. Everybody is generating so much data in this day and age. And there are many levels at which we're having this conversation. So for us, when we talk about some of that nuance at Development Gateway, we're looking at, there are communal focused views around individual, like the idea that individual rights is the only way to conceptualize, rights and protections is very much a 20th century issue. In the 21st century, we're looking at communities, we're looking at groups of people and how their rights are affected. So when we talk about what geopolitics looks like, it's not just a plug and play from the GDPR in Europe to put it in Malawi, for example. We've done work with MCC in Malawi that essentially looks at how...
Beverly, we lost you for a second there. I'm not sure if it was just me.
I think I hit the mute button.
Just repeat what you said, please, because we lost you for the last 20 seconds.
Oh, sure. So what I essentially said was that we've done some work with the Millennium Challenge Corporation in Malawi, looking at, in Europe, the general data protection sort of regulations make sense in a highly corporate environment. But when you're in Malawi, you've got a lot of small and medium business enterprises. So thinking about how we adapt, how we establish norms at a global level, but that are really well anchored in what is happening, what is needed at the local level. That's really what we're talking about, I think, when we talk about geopolitics of data.
Thanks, Beverly. So Steve, I mean, you're working with many organizations across a kind of global level, looking at, trying to kind of uniformity, trying to find ways of working and communicating that mean that there isn't just one size that fits all. But I suppose that different jurisdictions, different nationalities can get behind a size of some sort or shape or form. Can you just expand on how would you address the challenges that have been faced? So GDPR does not fit all. It's completely kind of not fit for purpose in certain parts of the world. What are you seeing as the kind of criticality around getting data sharing right? And what have you seen lessons learned?
Yeah, well, thanks, Stuart. So I think Parry and Beverly have kind of given a very good background to the challenges that are facing us. So at the UN system, what we're trying to do, and I can divide this into two. On one level, at the statistical level, we're trying to find a way to work together across the agencies with countries to ensure that we can produce statistics as a public good to inform public policy, but do that in a way that doesn't support any kind of data colonialism, doesn't jeopardize individual communities, but at the same time, we don't leave communities behind that are maybe difficult to measure. And that's one of the risks all the time, is that because something is difficult to measure, that you don't measure it. On the other hand, we're also looking and concerned about a fragmenting kind of data universe and trying to see how do we prepare ourselves for the future. And I think that's back to the point that Parry made about the architecture isn't really fit for purpose anymore to deal with such a complex issue. So the chief statisticians of the UN system have kind of put forward this idea that we need some sort of a data compact, a data convention, whatever you want to call it, almost a Bill of Rights kind of approach for data. But crucially, that can't be just driven by member states anymore. It must include the private sector, but it must also include civil society. Because as Beverly said, we're all individually generating data. But the idea that we only think of data now as an individual concept, I think is wrong. So I think we need to look at individual, but we also need to balance that with community, both in terms of privacy, but also in terms of access and in terms of benefit.
Thanks, Steve. I mean, look, this is striking a chord with some other sessions across the summit today, which is, how do we redress the balance? The kind of power of data is held by so few organizations. There are, of course, some great initiatives going on in kind of small pockets or specific pockets. I think there's some great work around data commons going on in Barcelona, for example, and I forget the other city that was mentioned that is trying to kind of push back control, if you like, of some of the data to the people who it's about or who generate it. That's kind of great at a local level. You talk about, I just want to explore this idea of a kind of a universal agreement. Like how would that go? How would we make that happen, Parry? How could you see what steps would we need to get there?
To reach a universal agreement, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Well, I think what we need to realize that in this, there are three players to begin with, three sort of groups of players or categories of players, which with their own concerns. It's the general public, which often is concerned about privacy. It's nation states, which are concerned about national interest and security. And then you have private sector, which is concerned about the value of data. So bringing this diverse interest and then putting it in a geopolitical scene, which also there are huge differences between various nation states, regions, and requirements. And we got to realize there are these different visions of internet and how it should be, and therefore how data should flow. All of that adds to complexity. And then there are differences. For example, while transatlantic relations are positive and are very close, still there's huge cultural differences. For example, United States, the freedom of speech is very important, when in Europe, privacy is far more emphasized and important. Then you have China, which has totally different view. So bringing all these together is extremely difficult. And that's what I'm saying, that the current tools we have, which is the rule-based system, is not quite compatible. And we need to imagine new forms. For example, multi-stakeholder models are evolving, but are they enough? There is a lot of tension there, and we need to come with creative forms of collaboration to allow for various forms without a splinter net or without breaking this openness of global system.
Thanks, Parry. I mean, I think the splinter net was a concept, obviously, that coined by an academic some years ago, and you've highlighted the cultural differences there. We've got some good questions starting to trickle in on the chat here. Just Jess Middleton's asked, Steve touched on data colonialism. It kind of builds off Parry's last point. How can that be avoided when creating uniform frameworks? Steve, let's throw that one back to you, seeing as you mentioned data colonialism.
Well, I think one of the first challenges is to make countries aware of it. There's huge pressure, I think, on developing.
Can you say what it is? What is data colonialism for the
Data colonialism simply is to extract data from countries and use it for the benefit of somebody else. So you treat it as any other extractive industry, in the same as mining or labor. So the reason you want to combat it is you want to make sure that the people, the communities, the countries that are supplying the data, they get the benefit of that data. And I don't necessarily mean financially, but they get the benefit of, if that's been used to inform policy or anything, those policies should benefit that community. So they shouldn't be left out of the discussion. They shouldn't be left out of the analysis. So what we want to do is combat this kind of extractive nature where we're all essentially being harvested And in particular, what we see in developing countries where maybe regulation, where governance isn't as strong as in other countries, and that perhaps they're not prepared. And I think, at least in the statistical community, I think there's huge pressure on developing countries to do what they call jump ahead, to start using big data, to start using new types of data. But again, that they may not have the governance in place. And I think they need to be given the space to think about this and to put the governance in place, and to put in place governance that suits them. It's to take this idea that Beverly mentioned. It's not to take European governance models and just stick it into some African country or some Latin American country. They need to be able to decide for themselves what's the appropriate model for their community.
Thank you,
maybe I can jump in here.
Yeah, please do, Beverly.
I think Steve raises a really good point, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? We've had, speaking as a Nigerian, we've seen this story before around extraction. Speaking at Development Gateway, we've seen that work. But there are many examples in multi-stakeholder consultations, many examples of how you co-create systems and approaches and regimes with people. So at DG, how we work when we build and design tools is user-centered. And this is essentially the world that whether you build technology or not, or websites or not, it's about putting the user at the center of what you're doing and what you understand.
Well, Beverly, can you jump in for a sec? Can you give us some of what you think the best examples are? Because we're seeing quite a lot of questions here about, how can, the one at the top, which is anonymous, is how can data decolonialism be further advanced? I think we've created quite an interesting narrative here. So just give us some examples of some of the best things you've seen being done.
I think simply is to ask. It sounds so basic, but it's about curiosity. When we work with our government partners around the world, we start with what we call our CALM methodology. But it's essentially, sometimes called a political economy analysis. It has many different names, many different faces, but we've used them many times in academic and non-academic settings around the world. The idea is, you understand, you at the heart of the use, supply and demand of data, you know better than anybody what you want and what you need and what you're missing. Ask. It's actually not that complicated. That's essentially how we build and how we work with our partners. We want to understand where the power lines are, where the strengths and weaknesses are, who the key stakeholders are, and then we work around that acknowledged reality to figure out how to make this space more transparent and better connected, so that everybody has the right data in the right hands when they need it. So I can talk about some examples of what we've done in Nigeria.
That would be great. I'm just conscious of a lot of the questions we've got coming in here, and I want to try and kind of, if you merge a few of them together to make best use of the time we've got and direct them accordingly. We've got a question from Rose Crozier about what is the view of China on data and open data. Now, we don't obviously have someone to represent China here today, but I believe, Parry, you've got experience working in that part of the world, right?
Yes.
Tell us what you think on that.
Yeah, you see, we tend to divide the world to authoritative and democracies and divide it that way. But the world is far more complex and there's a lot of gray area. So it's also very easy to assume China, and of course it has this great firewall around its, internet. So it is authoritative. But nevertheless, there are within that system, there are some ability to share data. And we saw it during the pandemic. There was a lot of collaboration going on. But it's a very, very controlled sort of openness, I would call it, where, for example, in US, we have it very open, and Silicon Valley had this anarchist idea of the complete open internet, saying that data wants to be free. US has limited, it believes in free market with some limited control. Europe has different view of it. So we have these different regions. Within those regions, we have China, which has a great firewall, and is very controlled sort of data sharing or data flow. So it's extremely controlled.
Thanks, Parry. We've got quite a few questions around the concept of open data in geopolitics. I mean, we've had sessions earlier today about the opportunity for sharing data to help tackle climate change, for example. I mean, we've all seen how sharing data can help in things like vaccine development or in understanding the journey of the pandemic across the globe. Steve, you often, I guess, through your career have wrestled with trying to get everyone to work from common approaches for statistics to give us a perspective on things accurately globally. What if you consider open data? Are we at the kind of dawn of a new era of opportunity for open data internationally, do you think? I mean, what do you think the big wins could be for open data if we think at a geopolitical level?
Well, first of all, just let me say, I believe in open data. I mean, as far as possible, I think certainly for international organizations, for statistical offices, we should be producing public goods, which means open access and equal access to data for everybody at the same time. I do have an issue with the open data movement, though, and that is one, the open data movement to date has really focused on government or public sector data. And there's been no pressure really put on the private sector to open their data. So I wouldn't call it grievance, but my concern with open data is that it's creating or facilitating an asymmetry where the public sector, which is trying to open data anyway, they're putting more pressure to open data and make it more accessible, but they're allowing the private sector to really push data as a proprietary commercial asset. And there's been no commensurate pressure there to open their data.
That's a very fascinating point. So I do recall, and there will be people I'm sure who are more informed than me on this thread, that the Digital Economy Act in the UK, which was reformed a few years ago, did advance some of this a little bit, but perhaps did not go far enough. I forget the exact clause. I think it might have been 57. At the time, I was doing some work with the UK's Office for National Statistics. But I think you're right. There is an asymmetry there, and we clearly need to address that. There's been a lot of dialogue today about the kind of the great power private sector has, certainly in the Western world. But I mean, again, we live in the age of the perhaps certainly an era of the great China-US rivalry. Parry, if we consider what Steve's just said about this asymmetry, like, how do we tackle that and make it benefit everyone at a global level? How do you do that?
Yeah, the major problem we have is the frontier of progress is envisioned and innovated by private sector. So they create a kind of architecture, not intentionally. I don't want to imply that this is intentional sort of nasty thing in part of a private sector, but they're not fit to understand the geopolitical issues. So in their way, they innovate and envision and create these things. So problems appear afterwards, and policymakers come to the play after the problems actually appears in the scene. So that's the major problem. The actual architecture of internet was created by private sector without thinking about security. Of course, there was a government input as well. But once these architectures are created, the codes are political. Once they are embedded, it's very difficult to go back. And then we are just dealing with aftermath. So how we can deal with this? I think I go again back to multi-stakeholder model. It's out of dialogue that private sector would understand its responsibility and problems that could appear, and policymakers could see issues from their point of view. So we need to create this kind of dialogue at early stage, not aftermath of problems, not after architectures are created and problems has appeared. That's where I see the problem. This constant dialogue between the private sector and government.
Thanks, Parry. I mean, I think shifting this up the agenda is what I'm hearing from you. I mean, just there's a lot of questions coming in here. I think there's one that, to be inclusive of the audience here, we should definitely jump on, which is where has it gone? How can if we were to have a data bill of rights, how could it be enforced, and how do we ensure that enforcement isn't just maximizing Euro-Atlantic power? That's a good one. Beverly, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so actually I wanted to return to something that Parry and Steve had said sort of as I think through this answer, because I think Parry really well laid out some of the challenges and and Steve as well. But I think there are some real opportunities here if we start to ask the question, what do we consider to be data? Steve made the excellent point, especially as a statistician, that we have a very narrow idea of what data and information is. I think that's one of the biggest opportunities. Redefining what we consider to be data and information and who we consider to be collectors of that information. What I wanted to give a shout out to the Data Values Project at GPSDD, because I had the chance to write about Haiti.
Can you just spell out the acronym for people, please?
Sorry, the Global Partnership for Sustainable Data and Development. I hope I got that right. But essentially, just to say that they have this fantastic digest. It's like super short. I had a chance to write about data and a little bit of this data colonialism and conversation in Haiti post the recent earthquake. Long story short is essentially one of the most examples I was the most excited about was about how 10 years ago, Haiti had next to no seismologists. Now they have 6. And they've built a community-based seismology model in rural parts of Haiti that are difficult to access by major government seismology centers. And now you have fathers and families and community members contributing to data points on seismology around earthquake prevention and protection. That's not something that was happening, I don't think, in Haiti 10 years ago, but it is now. So I want to make sure that there's a positive note in there, that there's a lot happening.
Well, I think that's just sticking here with you for a second. I mean, and I asked about kind of making sure this isn't just for Europe and Atlantic kind of consensus.
And that's a part of it, is bringing those kind of.
Yeah, I mean, we've just got a couple of minutes left. There's another question around, can trade agreements be a beneficial route to pressure private sector on open data and ensure a sovereignty of benefits for global South countries? That's a great question, right? I mean, that's kind of a closed question. What do you think, Beverly? You've got a lot of experience working in the global South.
Sure, I think that's one avenue. I think that's a very common one. But again, I like to refocus and have us talk about it from a community perspective, which is also how are we empowering people at different. So especially that question around making sure it's not just focused on a European-centric approach, is that citizens and community members at all levels need to be having that conversation. You can pressure at one point at the treaty level, but you also need your citizens in France and your citizens in the US and your citizens in Kenya to be engaged with their respective corporations and governments to continue to have that conversation. I think you encourage private sector to partner with the public when it comes from multiple angles.
Thanks, Beverly. Listen, we've got just 1 minute left. And so to make sure I use that time proportionately amongst our fantastic panelists, I'd like to quickly pass to Parry for her to give her 30 seconds before she passes to Steve and then Beverly on data sharing. We've painted at the beginning a kind of doomsday picture, but we've also highlighted some great opportunities for data sharing in the geopolitical landscape. If you had to kind of pick what you think that the most exciting opportunity for data sharing is, what would you say it is?
Well, I think that if you look at the last century, we saw that nuclear deterrent acted to prevent any major conflicts between superpowers. I think that we as a human race, we're facing some existential threats coming from climate change, coming from pandemic, and therefore nothing unites. Actually, if I want to borrow a sentence from Game of Thrones, it says winter is coming and we have to unite. And here I think that we have no choice but to unite. And we saw that despite all the differences, despite all the conversation about decoupling and the word is kind of conflicts and Cold War. Reality is during pandemic we united.
Thanks, Parry. I'm going to stop you there because I need to give Steve his time too. Steve, what would you summarize?
I think simply we want to facilitate data sharing as far as possible so that everybody benefits. But we have to be very careful what we mean. To come back to Beverly's point, what do we mean by data? And we also need to be very careful about what do we mean by sharing. I've written a piece about this. Those two words hide such a wealth of interpretation. So we just need to be very careful. But I think there are huge opportunities to share data, to facilitate trade, to benefit communities. But there's enormous pitfalls too if we get it wrong. So it's really to take time now to think about it carefully and then think about how to go forward. But the crucial thing is to do it so it's equitable.
Thanks, Steve. That's a nice summary. Beverly, your views, please.
Around data sharing?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of based on what Parry and Steve have said, if you had to kind of pick something else or amplify something they've said, look, what do you think the kind of greatest opportunities, or to use Steve's word, pitfalls are? Where do we strike the balance going forward?
Yeah, so actually I was I want to loop in an answer because Nai had asked a question in the chat, so I'll use that to sort of wrap up. And I essentially I was writing to say that we spend a lot of time focused on global convening spaces, but we need to start asking where those local ones are. I think, for example, there are some excellent conversations happening in Kenya, in Nairobi, around trade agreements and what that means for Kenya, what that means for African countries. And that research is done by Dr. Melissa Amino at the Center for Intellectual Property and Trade. I'm forgetting the name of the university in Kenya, but you can Google this. But let's reframe where, not just what conversations are happening, but where they're happening, because we know when they're happening in Europe or the US and other places, not everybody is able to go to those places and be a part of that conversation. And they have to be if we're going to have a really robust regime going forward.
Well, thank you to all of you, Parry, Steve, Beverly, for some fantastic input here. I found it both informative and thought-provoking, and it's definitely buoyed my interest to kind of explore more how the ODI can support this opportunity and help tackle, and research the questions that have been raised today. I mean, a lot more work needs to be done. We're very much in the early stages of our world of data. So thank you for discussing what this means in the geopolitical landscape. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of Summit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ODI.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I'll stay for a second, see if I can drop that link into the chat. I don't know if I'm allowed to stay in the room to do
Yeah,
that.
of course you are. Please do. I'm not sure whether we get cut off, so we'll see. Some good
Do it
questions.
quickly.
Let me look that up.
We've not been cut off yet.
Oh, good. Okay. So since we're still on, I'll just say that, so it was Strathmore University. So in general, so I follow the center. They do some excellent research. If you go on their website, go on their Twitter, they're generating I think some really excellent content around how we have that conversation about sort of the WTO and what that means for many countries, including African ones.
Thanks for digging that out, Beverly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thanks to both of you.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Parry,
No, thank you. Thanks, Parry.
Very
Thank
nice
you,
to-
Beverly.
Thank you. Thanks, both of you.
Bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.